Welcome to the ACT branch of the AIIA. I'm Heath McMichael and branch president. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. In recent years, we've been reminded of the vicissitudes of Australia's relationship with China, trade downturns and ministerial freeze-outs capturing the headlines. But tonight, we're going to turn the clock back to an arguably simpler period of Australia's relations with China at the outbreak of the Pacific War and before the formation of the People's Republic. In particular, we will look at the unsung heroes who helped establish the wide-ranging bilateral relationship we have today. To help us on this journey, we welcome back someone who knows a great deal about our diplomatic history, Emeritus Professor James Cotton from the University of New South Wales, Canberra, formerly known as ADFA. It's a pleasure to have James with us again, not only as a fellow of the AIIA, but as a long-standing member of the branch. You may recall he's addressed us on a number of occasions in the past about developments in East Asia and other topics. As to his bio, well, James was a foundation member of the Foreign Ministers Advisory Council in 1997. He's had appointments at Princeton, where he was a Proctor Fellow, and at the Woodrow Wilson Centre for International Scholars in Washington, where he was Australian Scholar in 2009. In 2013, he was a Harold White Fellow in the Australian National Library. James is currently working on the official history of DFAT and its forerunners. His latest book is Australians at Geneva, Internationalist Diplomacy in the Interwar Years. Now, as per our normal format, I should say, James will speak for about 20 minutes or so.
Oh, make it 30.
30. Well, all the more fun for the rest of us, I'm sure. Before we take questions in our normal way, from people in-house and participants online using the Q&A function on Zoom. So we aim to finish at 7 p.m. So without any further ado, over to James. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Kind introduction. Let's have the first slide. Okay, my subject is the Chungking Follies, as you see. Now, I'm aware that it's not Chungking, it's Chongqing. But the thing about Chongqing is that's the place where the current methods of governance of the PRC were first trialled, although not by their current beneficiary. It was also where Neil Heywood met his untimely end, possibly at the hands of Gu Kailai. But so it's not a happy place. So what we're going to do is we're definitely going to go to Chungking, not Chongqing. And Chungking is that fabled treaty port, more than 1,000 river miles up the Yangtze from Shanghai and the mountain fastness of Sichuan, still with part of its ancient city wall. Then the temporary capital of China. It had become the temporary capital of China in late 1937. Its population swollen by refugees and various political hangers-on, and under relentless Japanese attack. Well, we opened our first mission in China under the headship of Frederic Eggleston, Sir Frederick Eggleston. There you can see him there in the sedan chair. And the two individuals at the back there, the one on the left is Keith Waller. Later, of course, Sir Keith, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. The person on the right is Charles Lee. And those people were the two principal diplomats in the initial mission. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, the place was then under attack. This was actually a photograph taken from the vicinity of the first Australian mission by one of the people I'll talk about. Next slide, please. And here we have the swearing-in ceremony where Eggleston presented his credentials to President Lin's son on the 26th of October, 1941, so just before the outbreak of the Pacific War. Well, now the story of that mission is pretty well told by a number of individuals. I can recommend Warren Osmond's very fine biography of Eggleston, for example. What I want to concentrate on is the story that's not so well told, and in particular, 4 individuals two individuals who were appointed, first of all, in Australia and made their way to Chungking as part of the mission, and then two individuals who were appointed while the mission was being set up in China itself. So let me come to the next slide, please. Well, here we have two people who, as you'll discover a bit later on, worked for the mission. Over here we have Bill Westwood. There we have his wife on the other side, Sophie Sylvia Westwood. I'll say some more about her a bit later on. Now, Bill was a China hand, the son of a rather indigent family, one of 13 children. As a very young man, he made his way to China in 1928, and he became a Shanghai policeman, and was a Shanghai policeman up until 1940. Next slide, please. And there's Bill in his uniform. Now, while I later on said rude things about him, he's only a jumbo elephant of a policeman. But in fact, Bill played for Shanghai against England in football. He was a bit of an athlete. The thing about Bill was he had seen a newspaper story about the opening of the mission, realized that his China expertise might be of some use. He'd come to Australia in 1940 because he could see that war was about to break out. He brought his wife, Sophie Sylvia, with him and his young daughter, Lynn. But he decided that this might be the kind of job that he could do. And as a result, he was appointed as a chauffeur caretaker for the new mission. Now, he was discharged from the military, which he just joined in order to take up this position. And along with Keith Waller, we've already met Keith Waller, and that's a name that's well known. He departed on the flying boat by way of Singapore to Rangoon on the 14th of August, 1941, and he got there 5 days later. Just to give you an idea, the ticket for the flight was something like half a workman's wages in those days. Now, under the prevailing conditions, in Chungking, there was a shortage of everything. The city had been swollen by large numbers of refugees. It's a very remote city, and certainly was extremely remote. In those days, no railway line connected it to the coast or even other major cities. Everything was in short supply, so it was absolutely essential for the mission to take most of its own supplies. And this extended even to crockery and cutlery and stationery, and even sacks of coal were taken into Chungking in order to get the mission underway. The only way that that could be done was by truck from Rangoon up to Lashio, then onto the Burma Road, up over the Himalayas, and ultimately to Chungking by way of Kunming. A very difficult trip. Let's have another slide, please. And Bill made 3 passages of the Burma Road. And let me just quote you what he said about that. Regarding my service to the legation, I consider it nothing to boast about, especially in view of what other men are doing today. But I did the Burma Road 3 times, and I did exist on that road for 70 days on Chinese food, sleeping in bug-infested Chinese huts, lying in snow and mud under trucks, fixing engines, etc., and urging my Indian drivers on when they felt like throwing up the sponge. I do not need to give you a story of the road. Suffice it to say that hundreds of trucks went over the side and a considerable number of drivers were killed. Let's have a look at the next slide, please. That's the kind of terrain that these people had to negotiate. It took weeks to go from Upper Burma ultimately to Chungking. Now, after Waller and Bill Westwood arrived in Rangoon, Bill organized the first truck convoy and made his way up to can you let someone in? Well, how much money are they going to pay? Okay. Okay. Bill organized the first truck convoy. Meanwhile, Waller made his first flight into China to initiate the business of opening the mission. I'll come back to that a bit later on. So we've got Waller flying, making his first brief visit to Chungking. We've got Bill driving the truck up to Chungking by way of the Burma Road. Let's have the next slide, please. I just love this. Just love this picture. That's Bill on the left. That's his Chinese driver on the right, and you can see the truck. It's emblazoned across there, Her Majesty's Australian Legation in China. And I so like that picture that I'm going to ask the department if they don't mind using it on the cover, but of course it's up to them to determine. I'd have to say none of these pictures have ever been seen in Australia. They're all family items that I've managed to winkle out of the records. This brings me to my next character, and the trouble with William Stanley Mew, next slide please, as he's one of those minor characters in the plot, but he's so colourful that he threatens to overwhelm the action and become the central figure. Okay, I can only tell you a few stories about William Stanley Mew. It would be worth, it's a novel at least. Okay, so William Stanley Mew was appointed as a typist clerk. Now, he was born in 1893 in London. He arrived as an immigrant in Australia in 1909. He was married in 1912. He had 5 children. He volunteered for the first AIF, and in fact, he was wounded and gassed in France. He'd had a varied career thereafter, including in broadcasting and in the import-export business. More about that anon. But he saw an advertisement in the newspaper for possible appointees in the new Australian legation in Tokyo, because Australia was also opening in Tokyo, and in fact opened in Tokyo before in Chungking. But he was interviewed by Waller, who decided that in fact he would be suitable for the mission in China. He had a glowing reference from the people in the military. He'd gone back into the Australian military in 1940. And so he also was discharged from the military like Bill Westwood. His job, though, was to first of all accumulate stores in Australia, and then with Charles Lee, we've already met Charles Lee in that photograph, you'll recall. Charles, by the way, Australian born, but of Chinese parentage. Well, actually, he wasn't the first, because I'll answer that in the question. He was the second Asian Australian to work in foreign affairs, and had a long and distinguished career in foreign affairs. Their job was to accumulate stores, then to take ship from Australia. And after a number of adventures we don't have the time to talk about, on the 20th of September 1941, Charles and William Stanley Mew made their way by ship to Rangoon. They arrived in Rangoon about 3.5 weeks later. Bill Westwood had come back to Rangoon. They all met up in Rangoon. Then Charles Lee, Waller, and Eggleston flew off to China. Then it was the job of Bill Westwood and William Stanley Mew to organise a further truck convoy to Chungking, and it was a big truck convoy. There were 5 trucks, and also it was the ambassador's car. Well, they had some really interesting adventures getting into China. And a bit later on, Bill Westwood had to write a report about his experiences. And he said working with Mew was exceedingly difficult. Mew repeatedly delayed the departure of the convoy, including, quote, to stop at the house of a coloured woman with whom he had been associating. He openly boasted of the contraband that he was carrying. He suggested to Bill Westwood that they steal some of the supplies and sell them for private profit. He arranged for some Chinese customs officials to ride on the trucks and to pay him directly for the privilege. Lots of other misdemeanors, including selling a lot of items that he brought with him along the road, obviously making quite a lot of money. When he arrived in the temporary Chinese capital, finally on the 4th of January 1942, he capped off this performance by an attempted sexual assault on the wife of one of the legation's cooks. It was then discovered that there were some 20 packages, something like a ton of supplies on the trucks that were actually items that he himself had brought, intended for resale in China. Eggleston decided that this was impossible; he had to leave, but in fact was actually sufficiently sympathetic to agree to buy these supplies at cost, so that William Stanley Muir was not out of pocket. So there's Muir in Chungking. He's released from Australian service, but of course he's marooned in China. So the legation very kindly arranged for his air passage by way of India back to Australia. Meanwhile, of course, the Pacific War has broken out. The Japanese are descending into Southeast Asia, so transport is at a premium. So he's lucky to be able to travel at all. When he arrives in Calcutta, he passes 2 dud checks using his diplomatic passport as a way of convincing the bank of his bona fides. He got up to other adventures. We don't have the time to consider them. But once back in Australia, he became a subject of interest to the security forces, and they found out a lot about him. But what they didn't find out was that, in fact, when he had been in the first AIF in France, he had been court-martialed for being 4 months absent without leave, for impersonating an NCO, for having a forged leave pass, and for escaping from custody, where as a result he was fined 447 days pay and received 8 months jail. It's no wonder he didn't declare his first war service when he enrolled in the military in the Second War. But the security services did find out quite a lot about him. And they determined that in his bank account in Chungking, he had more than £600, which indicated that he must have made a lot of money on his way into China. They also discovered that he hadn't paid a tax return, hadn't made a tax return since 1933, and he owed the taxman £157, and the taxman had been chasing him for years to get recompense. They did interview his wife, Marie. In fact, wasn't his wife, or if there had been a marriage, it would have been bigamous because he was still married to his first wife. And she told some colourful stories about him, including his aliases. This is just what she said. Well, he used the name of Cortland. I know he used that name once in Queensland. In Western Australia at one period, he was known as Weston. He was known by the name Halley, partly in Tasmania and in Queensland. I think he was known as Halley when the summons for maintenance was served on him in Queensland in 1939 or 1940. The summons was served in the shop where I had an exhibition as Mr. Muir, otherwise known as Halley. It was served in Gympie. I had an exhibition of Oriental stuff, and he used the name of Halley. The summons in Western Australia was in the name of Weston. Yes, a colourful character. We know in the 1930s, he ran an import-export business. And in fact, the security services concluded after interviewing some people who were his associates that in fact he'd been engaged in the drug trade because he'd made 2 trips to Japan during this time. Remember, Japan in those days was the largest single source of illegal opiates in the world. And the Japanese had paid at least for one of these trips. And it's kind of ironic because he was also an amateur playwright, and he was the author of 3 plays that were broadcast on Queensland radio in the 1930s. One was Retribution, one was The Jewel Ring of Muhammad, and one was The Morphia Fiend. And in fact, he appeared in one of these radio plays himself. So it's kind of ironic that the author of The Morphia Fiend was probably a drug runner. I could tell you some more stories about William Stanley Muir, but like I say, he's one of those minor characters who threatens to overwhelm the action, but just by sheer momentum. Next slide, please. We want to go back to the scene in Chungking. There's Bill Westwood. He's working hard. He speaks reasonable Chinese. He's a China hand. And those kinds of people absolutely indispensable for the functioning of the mission. Lots of stories I could tell you about him, but we don't have the time. But the biggest single service that he did the mission was in the form of bringing his wife, Sylvia Sophie. She used the name Sylvia mostly in Chungking, but her first name was Sophie. There's two pictures of her. I think that's at Beta, but I'm not quite sure. But initially, she wasn't allowed to come to China, even though Westwood had asked the department, please, may I bring my wife? They said no. But she was a person of singular character. She was born in Russia in 1919. She, as a young girl, come to China. She was schooled in Shanghai. She was a linguist. She spoke French and Russian and English and Chinese. She was also a skilled secretary. She'd worked for the Jardine family at one point in Shanghai. She decided she was going to join Bill in China, and she and her young daughter Lynn took ship, originally intending to go to Rangoon, except that the Pacific War broke out while they were en route, so they were shunted off to India instead. She sent her money to Burma, so she had no money with her when she arrived. Fortunately, Roy Golland's Trade Commission Service arranged for her to receive some money on account, and then arranged an air passage for her to travel to Chungking. And when she arrived in Chungking, here's Eggleston with a very small staff indeed. And one of the original appointees to the staff was diverted elsewhere before he even arrived. Mew, meanwhile, had left in disgrace. And Charles Lee, most of his time was spent improving his Chinese, because that was the task that he was specifically charged with. Sophie Sylvia became Eggleston's private secretary. And she was an extremely competent private secretary. And in fact, Eggleston wrote a reference for her that talked about her very considerable skills and her keenness in performing the job. I could tell you some more stories about her. These are, again, family photographs that I managed to winkle out of an unlikely place, and I think, again, never been seen in Australia. But let's come to the next slide, because this is the person who's the most important person of all. I got to say just a few things about Eddie Burgoyne. Now, here's his personal identity card from the days when he worked in the British mission in China, because before he ever worked for the Australians, he worked for the British. And let's have another slide, please. And you can see, by the time we have anything to do with him, first of all, he was private secretary to the British mission in Chungking, to Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, who was the British ambassador who'd moved upriver and had taken up residence in Chungking. And then he worked for Eggleston as private secretary. Now, Eddie Burgoyne, a really interesting and also still a bit of a mysterious character. Eddie was born in Shanghai in 1917. His father, Aubrey, who was a businessman in China, was born in Maruya. And I don't need to tell the ACT branch where that is. Eddie was schooled partly in Shanghai, partly in Korea, where there was a very well-regarded American mission school. He worked in various capacities. He might have gone to St. John's University, although the documentation is not absolutely clear on that. But he worked from 1936 for the British mission. And let's go back to the first visit that Waller made to Chungking. This is taking the story back a little bit. He's making his first flight into Chungking. He wrote a very colourful memoir about that, and also described his adventures in a number of letters. And these are quite well known, and they've been used by biographers and others. When the plane landed it flew via Kunming, but when it landed in Chungking, it landed on this kind of large sandbank in the middle of the river. And when the river was high, it was quite a dangerous business to land there. Two people met the aeroplane, one person from the protocol division of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The other one was Eddie Burgoyne. Now, as far as Waller was aware, this is because the British had agreed that they might loan Burgoyne to the mission, because not only was he bilingual in Chinese and English, but of course he was thoroughly conversant with conditions in China, and just the kind of person who would open doors and make and facilitate the kind of tasks that Waller had to perform. But in fact, we know, and according to Waller's later testimony, Burgoyne's early contribution was absolutely indispensable. In fact, famously, Waller tried to visit the British mission in Chungking, and the guards at the gate wouldn't let him in, spoke no English, had no idea who he was. He was absolutely unable to function without Burgoyne, who was the one who did the translation, but also was the one who was aware of local conditions and was able to advise him what to do. And Waller is quite eloquent in his positive appraisal of Eddie Burgoyne. But it wasn't a case that the British loaned Burgoyne to the Australians. It was the case that Eddie volunteered to help the Australians. And we know that because in a personal letter, I winkled this out of a family archive. Nobody has been aware of this before. He says, and I quote, "A sudden flood of patriotism surged over me, and I threw a perfectly good job to come and work for the Australian legation, for I thought that I might just be able to assist them in establishing a legation in a country that none of them had ever been to and had no conception of the hardship and difficulties that they were to serve under. This I did. And though I'm not in the habit of blowing my own horn, I am forced to say, and the legation is the first to admit it, that without the help rendered by me, the Australian legation in China might not have been." Well, there are 2 points in particular to make about that. First of all, Eddie found the premises in which the legation was first situated, and it was there until October of the following year. Now, this was pretty important because here's a city under attack. The housing stock is being destroyed by aerial bombardment. Eddie himself was quite badly injured when part of the British mission had earlier been blown up by Japanese bombs, but also a city flooded with refugees. So finding a place to set up the mission was extremely difficult. Eddie found the mission. Eddie signed the documents, and the documentation for this is absolutely clear. Now, in personal correspondence and in his memoir, Waller says, "I found the mission and I organized the premises." And wasn't that fortunate? I'm afraid to say that's not the case. It was most definitely Eddie. The other thing to say about Eddie's support for Eggleston is that Eggleston arrived, as I said, sworn in 26th of October 1941. As soon as he had his feet under the desk, the legation actually opened for business on the 11th of November 1941. He was able to send to Canberra some extremely sophisticated reportage on conditions in China, opinion amongst the Chinese, so on and so forth. There is absolutely no question that Eddie was the source of this information, because Eggleston had actually visited China once before, but he was utterly dependent, of course, in his position, bound to be, on the intelligence that his staff was able to glean. Eddie was the principal source. If it wasn't Eddie, it was Charles Lee. Charles Lee was a fluent Cantonese speaker, and as it so happens, the core of the old early 1920s Canton Kuomintang regime that had been based in the south had sought refuge in Chungking. Charles got to know them very well and derived all kinds of intelligence from them. So Eggleston was extremely fortunate in having Eddie act as his private secretary. However, the situation wasn't to last. There are 2 reasons for that, I think. First of all, increasingly, Eddie found it hard to deal with Waller. He wrote a letter to Eggleston about this, which he never sent. I know he didn't, but it contains the following passage. "I have the highest regard for the ability of Mr. Waller, but his attitude of superiority, which at times reaches the borders of contempt for his juniors and inferiors, has made it impossible for me, whom I'm certain you will agree am easy to get along with, to remain in the legation. There was also, I'm afraid to say, a racist element to this. And this is best introduced by quoting a comment that Waller made about Charles Lee in a letter to Hood, his colleague back in Canberra. The poor wretch does not speak English, let alone Chinese. And the great tragedy of all is that he is reverting to type with astonishing rapidity. I found him using the Chinese privy one day. The point is, you cannot take a low-class Oriental and turn him into a high-class European. There was a racial element to it because Eddie was part Chinese. His grandmother was Chinese. Now, Wallace said he only discovered this quite late on in the mission. I'm a bit skeptical about that myself, but even if that was the case, Eddie would have seen the treatment that Waller handed out to Charles Lee, and undoubtedly heard some of the casual comments he made about the Chinese. But also Eddie wanted to fight. His family, his immediate family, were all in Japanese prison camps. He had no idea whether they were alive or dead. He wanted to fight the Japanese. Eventually, in April, he convinced April 1942, he convinced Eggleston that he really had to go and fight. It took some time to organise his passage, but in June 1942, he arrived in Australia. Next slide. Now, he tried to join the military, but they wouldn't have him initially. So he made some propaganda in favour of the Chinese. He published in the newspapers. He was interviewed by the ABC about conditions in China, and he appeared in a movie-tone film on conditions in China, along with H.J. Timperley, who of course was the Manchester Guardian correspondent in China, himself an Australian, and he famously was the first person to document the famous rape of Nanjing in 1937 and later published a book about it. And next slide. And there's Eddie in the movie tone film, which those wonderful people in the National Film and Sound Archive managed to find for me. Now, I've just got to tell you one or two more things about Eddie's adventures, because it's amazing stuff. He finally got into the Australian military. He worked in Australian military intelligence, but that wasn't good enough. He wanted to fight. So in early 1945, he convinced, probably using his influence, the fact that he had very good relations with Clark Kerr, who by that stage was British ambassador in Russia. They corresponded, I know, and he probably persuaded Clark Kerr to arrange it. He was invited by the British Army to join them in India, and he made his way to India in March 1945. Next slide, please. He joined the British military. He became a member of Force 136, jumping from aeroplanes behind the lines in Burma and China. He was mentioned in dispatches, lots of daring do. He was amongst the very first group of British service personnel to arrive in Shanghai. You see, Force 136. It's just amazing that identity card exists at all, but there it is. He was one of the first of the liberating soldiers to appear in the Shanghai camp where his family were imprisoned, and he was fortunate enough to find them all alive. Other adventures that I just have to mention to you very briefly. Next slide. 9th of September 1945, the Chinese authorities arranged an official surrender by the Japanese military to the Chinese government. The PRC has made a movie about it, and if you Google it, you'll find it. And they've used the same building, and it's quite convincing, but they haven't got this detail. There's the Chinese, there's the Japanese, but there's a crossbench. The crossbench has a number of observers and others. There's one British officer, Major General Eric Hayes, they managed to find, and he's witnessing the ceremony. Sitting next to Hayes is Eddie. And there he is there. And I know it's Eddie because I acquired the high resolution copy of it, and it's absolutely no doubt. And if you let me have the next slide, there's the official invitation, which exists still in his family's papers. Again, something that nobody has ever seen before. Now, I'm running out of time, but I've got to say two more things, Heath. I'm sorry about this. We'll leave Eddie. He got up to other adventures, including going back into military intelligence, but we don't know too much about that. Let's have the next slide. Now, in late 1942, the mission moved from the South Bank over to the main part of the city. That's the building it moved into. It still existed in 2017. I'm not sure whether it exists today. It was a more convenient building in one way, but it was a good deal smaller. So a number of the people they'd all been living under the same roof, could no longer live in the same building. And so the Westwoods, having done yeoman service all this time for Eggleston, were moved out to a hostel. However, by that time, the Westwoods were rather unhappy with their lot because they discovered that Waller, understandably, but from their point of view, not necessarily in a congenial manner, had decided that his fiancée, Alison, had to join him in Chungking, and that the position that Sylvia was discharging as private secretary, this would be just the position for her. And Westwood found out about this and was not very happy because, as far as he was aware, they were both doing a good job. And being China hands, were people who were contributing local knowledge, whereas Alison, although undoubtedly a clever lady, had never even been to China. So the legation was prejudicing the contribution of people who really knew their stuff. Another slide, please. Yeah. So there we have Waller, and we'll finish with that. The Westwoods didn't leave quietly. Bill Westwood acquired some of Waller's papers, including a newspaper article that he had drafted in September 1940 about John Curtin, which includes the phrase, he was a useless and dishonest phrasemaker without one positive achievement to his credit. And he sent it to Curtin. He also informed Canberra that Waller had been agitating behind the scenes against Hodgson because he blamed Hodgson for the fact that it was taking so long for Alison to make her way from the United States. If the circumstances had been a little bit different, I think Waller would have lost his job. He was extremely fortunate, of course, that the Japanese, meanwhile, having occupied most of Southeast Asia, stood in the way of any replacement being sent to China. So he was fairly safe in his position. But also, meanwhile, he'd made himself indispensable to Eggleston. Eggleston got on with him very well, and Eggleston defended him, even though it's an extremely interesting experience to read the correspondence between Hodgson and Eggleston. So Waller hung on to his job and, of course, rose to subsequent greatness. Okay, I've been talking about the two appointees who accompanied the mission in the early days. I've been talking about also those two local appointees who I think were indispensable to the early success of the mission, and in particular Eddie Burgoyne, who without whom I don't think the whole thing would have happened at all. In the existing accounts, there's a brief mention of Eddie Burgoyne. Fewster's life of Waller discusses Westwood to some extent because of this issue with Curtin. But I think the contribution of these individuals hasn't been acknowledged heretofore. I've been pleased to uncover the fact that they did play an important part. And I've been particularly pleased to be able to show that the person who made a difference in China was a Chinese Australian, indeed playing a similar kind of role to the person who was the early translator in Tokyo, who was a Japanese Australian, but that's another story for another time. Thank you.
Step straight into questions. If people could let us know who they are and speak loudly. First question too. Yes, Mark.
I just wondered, James, were there other Australians on the ground in Chungking at the time, whether in business or you mentioned the that might have played a role?
Yes, there were some other Australians. Wilfred Burchett was there. And in fact, Eggleston thought very highly of Burchett and derived all kinds of intelligence from him. And because of course Burchett was fortunate enough to be able to travel to the front line and was absolutely indispensable. W.T. Farmer, who was a Sydney journalist, was actually working for the Chinese government at the time as a kind of propaganda chief. Yeah, there were a number of Australians, and there were even Australian visitors. But of course, the point to remember is that in this more arrived later, but in these very early days, the conditions were so difficult, and of course, Chungking was very quickly cut off by the Japanese from the transit to Burma. It took a long time to organize the air route to India, which was a dangerous air route. They were constantly losing aircraft. So it was, for a long period of time, it was a difficult place to visit. But yes, there were some other Australians around.
James, I've heard you speak some years ago positively about Eggleston at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Could you say a bit about his role in China and how you see it?
Well, in my opinion, Eggleston, foreign policy intelligence, a still underrated person. If we just look at his work in China, when he arrived there, of course, he was, by sentiment, by background, by experience, he was an imperialist, and he thought highly of the British. But it didn't take him very long to realize that the British commitment in the Far East was in a hopeless condition. And so not long after the fall of Singapore, and after listening to the many sources that Eddie Burgoyne and others brought to him, talking to some of those press people and so on, he sent a number of lengthy documents back to Canberra saying, look, we have to realize that the days of the British commitment in the Far East are over. We'll have to make our own way. We won't be able to rely upon them. And in some ways, it might even be against our interests to identify with them too closely because they've been so unsuccessful. Not many people were saying it that openly. Eggleston was one of the first. Now, Eggleston got on well with Evatt for some strange reason. Of course, he'd been a Liberal cabinet minister in Victoria in the 20s and not a person of socialist inclinations at all, but he got on reasonably well with Evatt. But his experience in Chungking was for months. Nobody in Canberra seemed to take the least bit of interest in what the people in China were doing. They never got any documents from Australia. They had to guess what the Australian government was doing on the basis of press reports. It took a very long time for the department to organize itself to support the mission in China. So he was immensely frustrated by the lack of report that the reports that he'd received. But yes, if you look at those early documents through 1942, they're all digitized. You can read them. You can read them on the internet. There's some very clever, perceptive stuff being produced by Eggleston, who, like I say, is, for my money, most original person writing in this area in this country.
James, I might get one in about the backstory, really, to your story and the search for raw materials and sources to the extent you can. Can you tell us about how you manage that to get some of this original material?
Okay, well,
Yeah, you can sit there.
I'll sit there, but that's all right.
Camera's still on.
Yes, well, that's the least of my worries. Yes. It's extraordinary how much exists out there that's unexploited. And it's amazing how helpful people are these days, particularly on those genealogy websites. His family's papers by way of cousins and all of these people were terribly helpful. But I flew over to Perth to meet Alistair, who's Eddie's son, who's still alive. And I walked into his kitchen, and his large kitchen table, absolutely covered with paper and photographs. So much documentation of Eddie's life. And of course, as I say, nobody was aware of any of this. Fewster's book about, while I just mentions Eddie briefly, Osmond's book about Eggleston, there's 2 lines about Eddie, but he was a mysterious figure. But it turns out that actually, I said he went back into military intelligence when he came back to Australia after the war, and he was an officer in military intelligence until 1963. But there's not a lot of information about what he was doing. But I've been told by people who know him, including Rick Smith, who's here this evening, that he made many trips to Asia, and I can imagine he certainly did. But what is really telling for me, his closest childhood friend was a man called Alex Gavrilov. Gavrilov was a Russian emigre. Gavrilov made his way to Australia in 1940. He and a friend bicycled from Perth to Melbourne, or at least he made it all the way. His friend made it part of the way, trying to publicize the predicament of the Chinese under Japanese attack and in desperate need of international help. Gavrilov went into the military eventually. It was, being of Russian background, you see, it was difficult to get it. He eventually went into the military, became a linguist. He ended up as the commander of the Point Cook Language School. Now, he was Eddie's best friend. I can't believe that Eddie wasn't in the intelligence business. I know he worked for Rothmans in Western Australia later on. He was the local area manager, but I wonder whether that wasn't a convenient job for him, and that he was engaged in other activities. But of course, we can't document that. But anyway, that was Eddie. The Westwood family, again, they were all in South Africa, and I thought the likelihood of tracking material down in South Africa very difficult. But again, all those genealogy people, I went tracing him, a cousin, there's another cousin, try this one, you see. Oh no, they were enormously forthcoming. Oh yes, here's the reference that Eggleston wrote for Sylvia. Here's a picture of Sylvia back in Hong Kong firing the noonday gun. You know about that. All those wonderful photographs. And I said, well, can I possibly use? Oh yes, you can use any of those photos. Here's a scan, you see. So enormously helpful. There were a few other people who responded in that way. So I've been very lucky, but then I think you just have to, I mean, look, I had a conversation only this evening with somebody who told me about some wonderful letters that relate not to this mission, but another one of the missions at the same time, which I've yet to see. So there's a lot of material out there, which is still awaits exploitation.
Very good. John, I think you've got a question.
John, but I'm also a member here. I had a comment and question. I'm glad that Heath raised the issue about resources and diplomatic history, and some of you know that I've been chipping away with the project at the National Museum. It's interesting talking to the archives and the library. There's quite a lot going on, but no one joins the dots, and Heath's been very very patient. I've got to do a bit of a talk about my own experiences trying to join the dots, but I think there's a good opportunity now to push ahead with basically trying to get the national collecting institutions to work together. They are a bit siloed off the record, and I think it's really very important that we jump in. Obviously, in terms of both objects and papers, we live in a throwaway society. There's a window of about 15, 20 years. Things will be gone. They'll be thrown away. The next generation will keep things. So there's really a window, I think, to work on this. And these stories are absolutely galvanic. And I think we underestimate the interest. So I'm glad you asked that question. And I will be speaking to the Institute at some point on this topic, with apologies that that's sort of added in the future. But my question relates to Charles Lee. I mentioned on the way in that I discovered my father, actually, John Fred, joined External Affairs in 41, was actually posted to Chungking, and they changed their mind to Singapore instead. He took Eggleston through to Rangoon. I think he was well watered and well fed. I gather when he arrived, he wasn't in a very fit state, but didn't go on to Chungking. He went to Singapore instead. Extraordinary consequences that flowed from that. But Charles Lee must have had an extraordinary career. Imagine the sort of prejudice he would have encountered. Can you say a bit more about how he managed all that? And clearly the Waller quote is, I guess, indicative of the sort of challenges he faced, but obviously an extraordinary character. And your point about Cantonese answered a question for me. How could he work in that environment? Can you say a bit more about what he did and what happened subsequently to his career? Because it's an interesting story.
Well, Charles Lee was born in Darwin. He won a scholarship to go to school in Brisbane. He went to the University of Queensland. He joined the Commerce Department. ACV Melbourne, who was the Associate Professor of History in Queensland, who was a person of enormous knowledge about Asia and a great advocate for better relations between Australia and Asia, wrote him many references and tried to get him preferment. He was studying Japanese. After he graduated, he took up the study of Japanese. He then moved into external affairs, and according to the testimony of people who were there at the time, he was translating material both from Chinese and from Japanese for the department before he went to China. So his linguistic competence was already pretty good. Now, frankly, if you're a fluent Cantonese speaker and you know Chinese characters, it's not going to take you an awful long time to learn Putonghua. I mean, they've only got 4 tones after all. And I think he made rapid progress in acquiring spoken Chinese, but he already knew some before he went there. There's a manuscript by Rasmussen, who's also written the entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which goes into more detail about his career. He got to be in the department councillor. He never made it to head of mission, but he was a senior officer in the department. In fact, he served in Chungking all the way through, almost until the end. When he was in retirement and the prospect of opening a mission in Beijing became a real one, he was one of the people who was called on to advise them. How should we go about this? Who should we talk to? What kind of things should we prepare for? So he made an important contribution for a long period of time. But yes, he was a person of apparently unfailing good humor. There's some interviews with him where he always plays down the racism he must undoubtedly have encountered. I think altogether made a remarkable contribution to the department. Now, the cutoff for my history is 1942, so I don't deal with his subsequent story, but I think even the early contribution he made was a very important one.
James, can I add that from Chungking, he went to Nanjing.
Yes,
and
yes, that's right.
He moved there, delegation moved there.
That's right.
And he was there until 1st of October in 49, when they went to Shanghai and came out by ship and then closed down.
I see a question from Des.
Desmond Woods, councillor of the branch, just carrying on from your point. You made the point that Eggleston realised that the British were no longer wise and capable mentors for Australia. In 1947, the Navy did its annual rotation for the guardship at Nanking. And the decision was made that HMAS Shoalhaven, the next frigate in the list of ships that could go up there, was to be sent up there as the guardship to relieve HMS Concord, which was to come down the river. Well, Menzies was wise to the fact that one bank of the river was now entirely occupied by Mao's very accurate gunners, and said, what is the point and purpose of this, given the fact that the legations there could be evacuated by other means? And Shoalhaven did not go. HMS Amethyst went instead. And the Amethyst incident, in which the captain was killed, the doctor was killed, large numbers of men had to swim for the other bank. The ship got caught up in a diplomatic incident which lasted 9 months, and eventually, through cunning and deception, managed to get all the way back down and rejoin the fleet. God save the king. But my point is that if Menzies, well-known Anglophile, had not said this is not a good idea, it would have been the Shoalhaven incident
And the people who lost their lives would be an RAN, not RN.
Still, some things, sorry, some things remain the same. Anytime now, our sole Colin class submarine will be on its way to the Taiwan waters to do battle with all 73 PRC submarines. So, gosh.
Any other questions?
Charles, sorry.
Yes, Rick.
Rick Smith.
Yeah.
Friends too. Two things. Where are you publishing this? Is this all in the diplomatic history that you're writing, or is there a separate publication about Chungking? Secondly, can you just quickly tell us what happened? When did they close in Chungking, go to Nanjing? Do you know all that story? Just
Well,
quickly.
yes. They kept premises in Chungking for some time after the war. They moved to Nanjing, in my recollection, in late 45. But they kept that building going for a bit longer. On the first one, well, of course, it's up to the department to publish the official history, and you know, let's hope it appears sometime. You know, I'm sure it will. A lot of those details are not in the official history because William Stanley Mew, as colourful as he is, and certainly he deserves a paragraph or two. But you know, his authorship of the Morphia Fiend and so on, I don't think that's quite the subject. But I have written a separate article about these people, and that'll be published in some academic venue at some point. So I'm doing a number of more detailed items because I've come across a number of stories that are colourful but not exactly diplomatic history. So this will be a way, but you know.
So they went to Nanjing at the end of 35.
Yes.
And they were there until October 49.
Well, look, time has escaped us tonight. I'd like to, on behalf of the branch, extend our grateful thanks to James for opening this window on the part of the diplomatic history involving Australia's relations with China. Still many questions in my mind, not least of which the Department of External Affairs recruitment practices and how they time. But we'll have to leave that for another day. And hope that we can see some more fruits of your labours as they come out, James. So on behalf of the branch, I'd like to say thanks once more for coming along and please accept a small memento.
Very kind of you.